My name is Frank Annunziato. I'm the executive director of the AAUP here at URI. Welcome to Earth Day. I want to thank Eric for arranging for this to me, very poignant video from somebody who has really paid his dues with respect to defending our environment. I would like to also inform you that this Monday, coming up April 25th at 4 o'clock at the multi-purpose room of the Gender and Sexuality Center, Professor Loomis is going to be talking about his book, Out of Sight, which is about labor, the environment, and inequality. I have it. I've read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I really hope if you have the time, you can drop by and listen to Eric. As you could tell, he's a great, great speaker. So Monday again at the multi-purpose room, Gender and Sexuality Center. Please come and listen to Eric Loomis. Couple of things I'd like to point out to you. Some of you may be thinking, what the heck is the AAUP doing sponsoring a conference like this? And that's a good question. And the answer to that question, I think, is also important. And that is, we were founded on the principle of academic freedom in 1914, 1915. It came at an era when faculty members were being fired throughout the United States for expressing the results of their research, the results of their science. The most famous case took place at Stanford University, where Mrs. Leland Stanford, who was the only trustee at that time at Stanford University, fired a professor for speaking out against Chinese labor and speaking out, not Chinese labor, but Chinese slavery, really, and speaking out against the railroads. Well, as you all know, the Stanfords made their money from the railroads. And this was a result of his research. This was a result of his inquiry. And he was fired. This was happening all over the country. People were fired for teaching evolution, Darwinism, which was still a relatively new science at that point. So John Dewey, the great John Dewey, who's been forgotten, unfortunately, in academia, he and a few of his colleagues decided to found an organization that's dedicated to the notion of academic freedom and collegiality. But there's a corollary to that. Academic freedom also means academic honesty. And our faculty and the faculty everywhere in the United States is always, always under review, always, always under evaluation. At our university, no one gets promoted, no one gets tenure unless his or her work is subjected to the scrutiny, first of all, of his or her colleagues, and secondly, colleagues outside the university. There's no profession like this anywhere. And why is that? One, is the research good? Yes. And secondly, is it honest? Is it fair? So we have a commitment to academic freedom and to academic honesty. So it just fits that we would be interested in a conference of this magnitude, especially on a topic as important as this one. I remember the first Earth Day in 1970. It was a day of joy. It was a day of celebration. I was working in New Haven at that time, and I remember getting out of work and running down to the old New Haven Green. And there were, tie-dye and batik were everywhere. People were smoking, wacky tobacco everywhere. And from the Yale campus, which if you know New Haven is right across from the Green, from the Yale campus, blaring at the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun. It's an image I will never, ever forget. But it was joy. We're not as joyous anymore because of what we've done in that almost now 50 years. And that we haven't learned the lessons yet. So this is a very serious, almost somber day And let's hope that with our work collectively, we could begin to make it at least a bit joyous again. Finally, let me tell you about this panel. You are so lucky, believe me. With Senator Whitehouse's office, we have put together a tremendous panel for you. It's going to be a little bit difficult how we're going to do it, and we're expecting a little bit of aerobatics from our panel members. We're going to introduce them one at a time because they're going to have PowerPoint presentations, okay? When they are done, we're going to have them all come up back and sit in the chairs, and we're going to have like a little round table thing, and you will then be able to ask them questions and make comments and all that. So it'll go well. So please have a little patience. Now, I was educated by Jesuits, and that means that I know that the queen of all the sciences is really philosophy. All right, you could talk biology and all that other stuff, but it's really philosophy. So we're going to start out with a philosopher, and I think that that's appropriate. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at BU, Boston University, and he's an instructor at the Harvard Extension School. Lee has taught at Colgate, where he won a number of prizes, BU, Tufts, Simmons, on and on and on. He's the former executive director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard. He also served as a policy advisor to the executive dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard and as associate editor in the research department of the Federal Reserve Book. Lee is the author of 3 books, Respecting Truth, Willful Ignorance of the Internet Age, The Case for a Science of Human Behavior, and Laws and Explanation in the Social Sciences, Defending Science of Human Behavior. He is the author of a number of essays that have appeared in a number of journals. I'm not going to go through them all. I found out about him in a wonderful piece he had this year at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and my radar just went right out. We have to have him. So we're really fortunate and happy to have Professor Lee McIntyre as our first speaker.
Hello, I'm not used to a microphone, but I do want to make sure that everybody in the back can hear me. Everybody okay? Okay. So, as Frank said, I'm not a climate scientist or really any sort of scientist. I'm a philosopher, but I'm a philosopher of science, which is to say that I study the character of scientific reasoning and want to study whether scientific claims are justified. So I don't have any graphs or slides today to convince you that climate change is real. In this crowd, you don't need them. And there are other folks who are better qualified than I am to convince you of that if you need convincing. So you already understand that there's a scientific consensus on climate change. Importantly, you also understand that when we're studying an empirical matter, the scientific evidence is all that should count. Not our ideology, not our politics, not how we make our living, or how we feel about the issue. But the problem, even if we accept that in this room, is what to do about the people in the world, including a shockingly high percentage of folks who serve in the United States Congress, who don't believe this and who feel entitled to substitute their own judgment for the consensus of the world scientists, just kind of unbelievably, on this topic. Now, as a philosopher, I've always felt a little bit handicapped in what I could contribute to this topic. And some of you know that philosophers customarily think of themselves as having a good grasp on reasoning, but they don't like to weigh in very much on topics that are of particular importance to folks in the modern age, in the pressing issues of the day. I decided several years back that I wanted to eschew that because I was interested in how scientific claims were justified, and I was horrified by the number of people who felt free to look at the scientific evidence on any number of topics and say, well, I just don't believe it. as if that were somehow an argument, or somehow that didn't make them look ignorant, or if somehow that was supposed to convince someone else. It was shocking. So I'd done this other work on a science of human behavior, and then I looked up and I saw that natural science was under attack. And it was under attack by people who just refused to believe things even when it was in their face, which is called denialism, not skepticism, denialism, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So my most recent book is called Respecting Truth, in which I examined the intellectual roots of science denialism. That led to the piece that Frank read in the Chronicle. It also led to a piece in the New York Times about the difference between skepticism and denialism. That brought me some hate mail. And I was saying earlier, that also brought me my first hate phone call. If you've never gotten a hate phone call, it's really personal. Hate phone calls, I mean, you could just hang up on them, but it's just sort of unbelievable while it's happening. But it also, maybe resulted in getting me the invitation, so maybe that's not so bad. So, skepticism is something that philosophers care about a great deal, and scientists too. But the problem lately is that word, skepticism, if you follow the media, has been hijacked by a whole group of climate change deniers who've suddenly decided that they like the ring of how it sounds to say that they're a skeptic. It just sounds so dirty to call yourself a denialist. Nobody would want to call themselves a denier or a denialist because, well, Holocaust denier, other things they deny. Oh, we don't like that word. So let's call ourselves skeptics. And in fact, some of them, such as Ted Cruz, have recently put forward the idea that they're the ones who are actually being scientific. He recently more or less compared himself to Galileo, which was unbelievable. He said that until all the evidence is in, we just can't know whether climate change is real, that it's just a theory that hasn't been proven. And we've heard this about evolution and other topics. That, however, is to reveal a grave misunderstanding not only of how science works, but also of what it means to be a skeptic. Skepticism is when we withhold belief because the evidence doesn't live up to the high standards that we require, for instance, in science. Denialism is when we refuse to believe something even in the face of what others would take to be compelling evidence, because at some level it upsets us to think that it's true. With skepticism, we're not sure what to believe because the evidence hasn't compelled us. With denialism, we know damn well what we hope is true and may even shop for reasons to think that our views are correct. Now, in the throes of denialism, I imagine that it must feel a lot like skepticism. The rest of the world just doesn't get it. We're the ones being rigorous. How could all those other people who believe in climate change be so gullible before all the facts are in? But I think that if you find yourself feeling that way, say about another topic, it should be a warning when those stars align and you start to feel really self-righteous about a topic like that more than you do about good standards of scientific evidence. I don't know how many of you might have read Daniel Kahneman's recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow, but it's a terrific book talking about how the human mind has all sorts of wired-in shortcuts which can feel an awful lot like thinking. Within the dark recesses of cognitive bias, there are entire fields of academic inquiry, behavioral economics is one, that proposes to explain huge swaths of human behavior based on these mental foibles that we've always had in Galileo's time before. These have been there. What's different now is that there are entire television networks that are devoted to exploiting these cognitive foibles so that we begin to live in this kind of tribal silo where we just hear things back that we already believe and we're not challenging ourselves with other beliefs. So how do you tell a fact from an opinion? How do you tell skepticism from denialism? What I maintain is that by the time you sit down to evaluate the evidence for a scientific theory, it's probably too late. The real battle comes in training ourselves to embrace the right attitudes about belief formation in the first place. And for that, I think, of course I would, you need to do a little philosophy. What does it mean to be a denialist? Some people start off by saying, well, I'm no scientist, but there's actually a a page in Wikipedia called "Well, I'm No Scientist, But." You can look at, don't look it up right now, as I tell my students, but you can look that up, and it's and I didn't start, it's kind of an interesting page. So they'll start off, climate change deniers will sometimes start off by saying, "Well, I'm no scientist, but," and then they'll proceed to rattle off a series of evidential demands that would make Newton blush. What normally comes along for that ride is a telltale sign of denialism, that these alleged skeptics have different standards of evidence for the things that they want to believe than for the things that they don't want to believe. Now, we all know that the worst culprits here are conspiracy theorists, and denialism comes close to that. How many times have you heard a conspiracy theorist claim that we've not yet met a sufficiently high standard of evidence to believe some well-documented fact, such as that vaccines don't cause autism, and then immediately exhibit complete gullibility that the most unlikely correlations are true? For instance, that the CDC paid the Institute of Medicine to suppress the data on thimerosal. So that's what conspiracy theorists do. Complete gullibility on the one hand, complete denial on the other hand. And so this fits with the denialist pattern. Unlike the true skeptic, the denialist beliefs are not born of caring about evidence in the first place. What they care about most is ideology, and they'll do seemingly anything to protect it. This is why you see all of the cheating about scientific standards. So here I'm going to quote something from Ted Cruz on his position on climate change from August 2015. He said this, quote, "If you look at the satellite data in the last 18 years, there has been zero recorded warming. Now, the global warming alarmists, that's a problem for their theories. Their computer models show massive warming that satellites say ain't happening. We've discovered that NOAA, the federal government agencies, are cooking the books," end quote. Okay, now, there are some climate scientists in the room. I've got the graph over there. I don't have the slides, but we know what's wrong with that. But let me just say a little bit about philosophically what's wrong with that. So, for one thing, the graph that he's referring to is wrong, and it's since been corrected. All right, that happens sometimes in science, but here's the real problem. Even if that graph had been the correct one, he was misreading it because he's dishonest. Ask yourself why he chose 18 years. Okay, what was happening exactly? It's 19 years ago now, but what was happening exactly 18 years ago? Notice he didn't say 20 or 19 or even 17. He said 18. And he did that because 1997 was a very hot year due to El Nino, and it suited his purposes to choose that because it made the rest of the trend look not quite so alarming. If you look at the new graph, it's still plenty alarming. But if you look at the older graph and you read it right, it's alarming, but it's a little bit flatter. And so that's why he did it. He's cherry picking. That is not what scientists do. And that's not what skeptics do either. Cherry picking is one of the worst sins of data manipulation that a scientist can make. And climate change deniers do it all the time. Again, they like that ring of sounding like a scientist or a skeptic. So they'll quote some facts at you, but they're normally cherry-picked. And they do it because it makes them feel so virtuous, I think, to be citing actual evidence. Few scientists, though, would make that kind of an error of cherry-picking because they're schooled in the lessons of statistics and taught not to put theory ahead of evidence. But to an ideologue like Ted Cruz and others, it just feels perfectly natural to do this. The problem is that given the way science works, we leave ourselves open to this kind of misunderstanding, okay? And this is something I have to own as a philosopher of science, because philosophers of science have not done a good enough job, I think, in making it clear to the public how science actually works. In some sense, the climate change deniers are right about the way science works. It's not yet completely settled, and the idea of global warming is based on a scientific theory. But this is not due to any particular weakness in the study of climate change, because no science on any topic is ever completely settled. That's just how science works. Because science is based on empirical evidence, it's always possible that any theory can later be overthrown. Just ask Isaac Newton. As for the role of theory, as a matter of fact, gravity is also a theory. It's just a theory. So is the germ theory of disease. But we don't find the same kind of arguments made there. Again, it's cherry picking. They're using the argument where it fits. There's an important difference between a theory and a hypothesis. Just because it's technically true that any theory can be overthrown by new evidence, it doesn't mean that we're justified in disbelieving the scientific consensus on climate change. To disbelieve the overwhelming conclusion of scientists on a well-corroborated theory like global warming does not make one a skeptic, it makes one a fool. Scientific truths can never be completely verified. Like any other scientific theory, evolution, continental drift, vaccines, the Big Bang, there are always going to be holdouts, always going to be people waiting for that last shred of evidence. I was talking to somebody earlier about the fact that there's only 98% consensus on evolution. This is amongst scientists. So there's that last 2% who are holding out. I guess the last 150 years of evidence is not good enough for them. They're waiting for that last 2%. If those holdouts have scientific evidence for their beliefs, we have to listen to them. But if it's just wishful thinking, I think we're justified in moving on. There's such a thing as warrant for scientific beliefs. We're justified in believing a scientific theory, even if it has not been conclusively proven, because no theory in science has ever been conclusively proven. That's just how inductive reasoning works. And unlike ideological commitments, scientific theories are never 100%. That's why scientists are skeptics. And that's one thing that I want people who are climate change deniers to understand, that that's actually how science works and that that's a strength of science. The problem here is that denialism does not seem based on a good faith commitment to any sort of actual skepticism, but it's instead based on a grave misunderstanding of how science works. There's a vast difference between the sort of scientific skepticism that I've been talking about and the kind of faux skepticism that's embraced by denialists. In science, we look at the evidence before we form our views, but we also leave ourselves open to the possibility of changing our views over time as more and better evidence comes in. With denialism, one decides in advance on the basis of what we hope is true, and then look for evidence to prove it. And that's very different from science. So, given all that, in my book, Respecting Truth, I argued that denialism starts with willful ignorance, which is when you're not only ignorant, but you make the decision to stay ignorant. It's when the facts are available, but on the cover of my book, I've got a bunch of people covering their eyes. They choose not to look at them, despite widely available sources of information. Not surprisingly, that willful ignorance normally occurs for ideological reasons. Now, sometimes it starts off as cynical. Sometimes we know that our view isn't true, but we just can't admit it in public. This happens sometimes amongst politicians. They call it paying the crazy tax. Maybe Ted Cruz doesn't really believe what he believes, but he can't say in public. It also, one of my favorite quotations on this subject is from Upton Sinclair, who said, "It's pretty hard to get a man to believe something when his salary depends upon him not believing it," which maybe explains all those ExxonMobil executives. What I found in the course of researching my book is that if left unchecked, what happens is that sooner or later, maybe they do begin to really believe it. Maybe the cynical denialism becomes actual denialism. If we tell a lie long enough and we surround ourselves only with those who already agree with us, sooner or later the lie seems true. This is amply shown in Kahneman's book. I think, though, he was scooped by Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist, who said if you tell a lie long enough, people will begin to believe it. In any case, the dynamic here is that I think, and my argument is that there's a slippery slope from telling a lie to believing your own lie to beginning to believe that anybody who doesn't accept the lie has to be crazy. And I think that that's where we are, unfortunately, in the climate change debate, and that's denialism. That's when you haven't caught them in time, and what started as willful ignorance ends up as denialism, and at that point they're not even listening to facts anymore, and so argument may not help. So how do you stop the slippery slope? You have to get there in time. You have to challenge those who are lying and get to them before they've told the lie too many times, when they still know that they're lying, when there's a chance to stand up to them. You have to witness their attempts to obfuscate and to spread the lies to other people, which is, I think, kind of what we're trying to do today, which is why I'm so glad to be a part of it. But there's another, I'm going to close with another aspect to willful ignorance, which is harder to accept, but I'm going to leave it as a challenge to everybody in the room, because willful ignorance and denialism can occur about a lot of topics, not just climate change. And you may even harbor some willful ignorance yourselves about some topics that maybe you don't want to talk about. So I want to leave you with this challenge. The tendency toward willful ignorance exists in all of us on some things that maybe wish weren't true. So how to fight it? Study critical thinking. Study logic. I'm a philosopher, I have to say that. Read Kahneman's book. Identify the cognitive weaknesses that are part of the human condition, but also recognize that this is not necessarily our destiny. Just because we have all those cognitive foibles doesn't mean that we can't overcome them. We overcame them in Galileo's time. We can overcome them now as well. Even if our brains are not wired to search for truth, this does not mean that we can't pursue a path that leads us to better answers than the ones that are automatically supplied by the fast part of our brain. Truth may not be automatic, but it's still an option, but you have to choose that path about not just climate change, but any other things where you might be exhibiting willful ignorance. Thank you.
Lee, is there a difference? The Jesuits taught us that the only excuse for sin is invincible ignorance. Is there a difference between willful ignorance and invincible ignorance? Okay, all right. You gonna do the, yeah, all right. Then I'll introduce our next speaker. Cornelia Dean is a science writer and former science editor of the New York Times. She is now a distinguished lecturer and writer-in-resident at Brown University. She is a pioneer because she is one of the first women to get involved with these kinds of issues in such a prestigious way as the New York Times. And I know people who work at the New York Times, and it must have been very, very rough for a woman to break into that very male-dominated crew. She calls herself Corey. So from 1997 to 2003, she was the science editor of the New York Times. And she was responsible for the coverage of science, engineering, health, and medical news in the daily paper and in the Science Times section, which is as you should know, is every Tuesday. It's part of one of the greatness of the Tuesday New York Times, is this, which I always share with Professor Kirschenbaum. She worked in the Washington Bureau of the Times as deputy Washington editor. She worked as a assistant and then deputy science editor previously in the New York Times. In her editing tenure in the newspaper's science department, members of the staff have won Pulitzer Prizes twice, finalists 3 times, the Polk Award, and many other honors. In 2001, the newspaper weekly science section, Science Times, won the Lasker Award for Public Service. She began her writing career right here in Rhode Island in the Providence Journal, back when the Providence Journal was a great newspaper, okay? Her first book, Against the Tide, The Battle for America's Beaches, was published in 1999 by Columbia and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year award. Her guide to researchers on communicating with the public, Am I Making Myself Clear?, was published in 2009 by Harvard University Press. Both books are still in print. Her third book, about the misuse of scientific information in American public life, is in press, Harvard University Press. So we will have the pleasure to see that soon. She has taught at Harvard, Vassar, Columbia, and the University of Rhode Island. She's also on the faculty at Brown. Corey Dean, please.
wait, I have nothing. Oh, okay. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I taught here for years when I worked at the Projo, and I loved every minute of it. So I want to share with you a thought that I have heard many researchers enunciate over the years, which is, if everybody knew what I know, everybody would think the way I think, and all policy decisions would be made in ways that I personally would approve of. And as we know, well, let me stop and say, as a science journalist, I kind of buy into this in a way, because what I'm trying to do in science journalism is give everybody the information so that everyone would know what the scientists know. The only problem with the little theory is it's just not true. Lack of data, ignorance is not necessarily the problem. We call this, people who study science communication call this framework the deficit model. In other words, the problem is that the audience has a deficit, and that's why we're having a problem in communication. That is far from enough to explain what's going on. So I want to talk about three factors that I think contribute to it. One is an idea that I first heard from a man named Max Bazerman at Harvard. And I have to say, I'm a journalist, not a researcher or a scholar, so practically everything I tell you today will be an idea I have stolen from someone else. This one, the idea of predictable surprises, I first heard from Max Bazerman at Harvard Business School. Then there's the idea of motivated reasoning or cultural cognition, which Professor McIntyre kind of spoke about. And then finally, a problem in journalism that this actually is a phrase of mine, the problem of objectivity in journalism. So predictable surprises. This is the front of Max's book. So the idea of the predictable surprise is a serious problem that is inevitably going to confront your business. Max wrote it from the perspective of business. But a serious problem that is facing you, an existential threat possibly, that faces you that you just don't do anything about. And how can this be? So one of Max's examples was Enron. I don't know if people here remember this case, but a big energy company in Texas. And what happened with Enron was that there was a change in accounting rules such that accounting firms that did your audits of a business, they were now allowed to sell consulting services to their auditing clients. Consulting services are much more lucrative than auditing services. So now, if you're auditing a company and you want to sell it consulting services, are you necessarily going to be as sharp and nasty as necessary with your audits? No. It is ordained by God that you will not. And so you can see what happened to Enron. Its accounting became virtually imaginary. And this scandal, it cost thousands of employees their IRAs and their pensions. It was a big disaster, and it also brought about a lot of changes in the accounting industry, but it took the disaster to bring it about. Another one is locks on the cockpit door of airplanes. And it had been obvious for a long time that terrorists were interested in using airplanes. And there was a proposal, this happened in the Clinton administration, that airlines be required to put locks on the cockpit doors. And the airline industry said, "Are you kidding? That's going to cost us $1 billion. We don't want to do that." So the government backed off. Well, we know what happened in between, and we know now that there are locks on all the cockpit doors. But we didn't want to do that. My favorite, more recent example is the subprime mortgage crisis, which brought about the global financial collapse or contributed to it. I think you can also say it is ordained by God that if you give people mortgages without requiring them to demonstrate that they have any capacity to ever pay the mortgage off, that's going to end in tears. You don't have to be a financial genius to figure out that that's not a good idea, but that's what we did. So what Max Bazerman thought about was, well, you know, why do we do this to ourselves? We repeatedly do this kind of thing. Why do we do it? And so he came up with a number of reasons. The first is action is painful. So with the cockpit doors, the airlines were going to have $1 billion worth of pain to get the locks on the cockpit doors. The benefit from the action may be years in the future. If you are a politician, by the time the benefit occurs from this painful action, you may be out of office. You may even be dead. And finally, if the benefit that you derive from this painful action is that some nasty thing does not occur, in other words, the benefit is nothing happens, people may not even be aware that they have enjoyed a benefit. The only thing that they will know about is the pain. So in political, you have to be a courageous politician to embrace the infliction of pain for a benefit that your constituents may not ever know that they've ever enjoyed. And our political system is not necessarily doing this. We have, Professor McIntyre mentions willful ignorance. I heard a version of this phrase having to do with the flood insurance program, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes, but that there is such a thing as a constituency of ignorance. There is a constituency in favor of not confronting the facts or not even attempting to get the facts. So climate, this is, anybody here recognize this guy by any wild chance? This is Svante Arrhenius, who was a Swedish chemist around the turn of the 20th century and is cited as the first scientist to seriously raise the question, what is going to happen if we keep dumping carbon dioxide and other gases like that into the atmosphere? What's it going to do to the chemistry of the atmosphere, and what is the change in the chemistry of the atmosphere going to do to us on Earth? So this idea has been alive for 120 years. In 1850, CO2 parts per, what is it, million or billion? Parts per million? 280. 2015, we crossed the line into 400. We are inevitably, I think, going to get to 450 by 2050, and possibly, and lots of people say 600 is going to be very hard to avoid. We will have doubled the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're watching this. This is a graph made by a man named Charles Keeling, who was a scientist at Scripps. He went up to the top of Mauna Loa, the volcano in Hawaii, and started measuring how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. This is the chart that he devised. It's called the Keeling curve. And you would think, at least I would think, that people would be very interested in having this information. But there was a time as he started going along with this and the evidence started getting clearer and clearer, he ran out of money. And it was far from a done deal that he would get money to continue doing this. And I think part of the reason for that was this is information people don't want. So, another example of the constituency of ignorance. Here he's on the left, and that is his son, Ralph, who's continuing the work today, which I think is great. But anyway, so are we in any doubt that human activity is altering the chemistry of the atmosphere and that these changes are going to have implications on Earth? No, we are not. What's going to be, well, there will be many effects. I think the one that we are going to see soonest and with the greatest effect in the United States is sea level rise. We're already seeing it in many places. There are some flamboyant examples like water bubbling up through the coral foundations of the city of Miami and so on. But we have this issue in Newport. We have this issue in South County beaches. We have it in plenty of places in in Rhode Island. So these are various estimates of where we're going to end up in terms of sea level rise. All you can say about this now is that estimates that a few years ago were described as worst case scenarios are now described as the floor, the least we can expect. And there are always going to be arm wavers who are predicting disaster, but even sensible people are now predicting 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the 21st century, which is going to be an amazing change. So, what do we get from that? So this is the logo of an organization called NC20, which is an organization of the 20 coastal counties in North Carolina. And you can see on the edge, if you look at the map, the Outer Banks, which maybe some of you have been to, barrier islands along the coast of North Carolina. Those islands have, for almost their entire length, not all of it, but most of it, very low elevation, a matter of an average of well under 10 feet of elevation. If they encounter 3 feet of sea level rise, never mind 6, they're going to be in serious, serious trouble. So what do we get from this organization of coastal counties? Pressure on the legislature of North Carolina to reject the consensus of its own scientific advisory board that sea level rise is accelerating, and instead they pressured the legislature to pass legislation that forbids the officials of North Carolina to act as if sea level rise is accelerating. For their planning purposes, they have to assume it's not going to rise any more in the next 100 years than it did in the previous 100 years, which is something like 11 inches in North Carolina. So this, when they actually did this a few years ago, they encountered international ridicule, but they altered the thing a little bit around the edges, but that situation is still exists. So I would say this is a predictable surprise for North Carolina, a climate-related predictable surprise, and they're not doing anything about it. This is the town of Rhode in North Carolina, and this is after Sandy. But this kind of thing happens yearly in this stretch of the North Carolina coast. The evidence that these people are in trouble is in front of their eyes, and they're not doing anything about it. So the problem is people form beliefs about risk, especially, that reflect their ideas of how they think the world should be. It's what Professor McIntyre was talking about. My favorite example of this has nothing to do with climate, but I heard it on NPR. It was an interview with a woman in the Bay Area of California who was not going to vaccinate her children. And the reason was not because she personally thought that vaccination was going to be a problem for her kids, but she described her social circle in this town where she lived as crunchy moms. And crunchy moms do not believe in vaccination. And if she had her children vaccinated, she would be drummed out of the core of the crunchy moms. And she didn't want that to happen. So you just have to hope her children were not getting sick. So people who study this call this kind of thinking motivated reasoning or cultural cognition. Here I'm stealing from lots of people, but especially Dan Kahan of Yale Law School, who's done a lot of work on this. And he and others have devised tests to rate people on two axes. One is whether they're individualistic or communitarian, and the other is whether they're hierarchical or egalitarian. So you end up with a quadrant. If you know where somebody fits in that quadrant, you can predict with great accuracy what their views are going to be on a whole raft of subjects, including nuclear power, gun control, nanotechnology, the death penalty, all kinds of issues. It has nothing to do with how much they know about the issue. It has to do with their personality traits as measured by those scales. So, if you think about climate, if you imagine that we have a real problem facing us with climate, you might inevitably decide that there's going to have to be some national or even international action to combat this problem. If you are an individualistic, hierarchical person who doesn't believe in government regulation, are you going to be happy with this? No. You're going to do mentally whatever it takes to enable yourself to reject it. So, oh, sorry, wait a minute. I missed a page. I'm sorry. Anyway, so here's where we are with risk on the coast. The Government Accountability Office has a list of federal programs they think are at high risk. And one of their champions is the flood insurance program, which offers insurance, low-cost insurance to property owners on the coast. As of February 29th, it had 5.6 million policies in effect with 1.3 approximately trillion, sorry, 1.3 trillion dollars in outstanding coverage. That's how much we, the taxpayers, are liable for covering on coast and river areas now. The largest unfunded liability that the government faces after Social Security. So this is a predictable surprise. It isn't even a surprise anymore. The program supposedly supports itself. It went into the red almost immediately and has never crawled out. And after Katrina and Sandy, the Congressional Research Service says its chances of ever being above water again in the black are minuscule. It's just not going to happen. Anyway, so here we are with Sandy. There was a very, very short period of time after Sandy hit when you heard people like Governor Cuomo of New York say, we have to get people out of these areas, it's too dangerous. That lasted for about 2 days. And then people said, no, we're going to build back better than ever. Unfortunately, in the summer of 2012, there had been legislation passed, the Bigger Waters Act, that was modifying the flood insurance program to put it more in accord with reality, make it more actuarially sound. This was going to raise people's premiums and limit their ability to rebuild on the coast. After Sandy, efforts began to chip away at that legislation, and it has lost much of its force. Okay, so this man is former Congressman Bob Inglis of South Carolina. And he is an example of what happens when a politician does not take adequate cognizance of the possibly irrational views of his constituents. So he is described as having been a, quote, reliably conservative Republican member of the Congress. He got it into his head that perhaps there was something to this climate business, that we should pay attention to it. He spoke out against climate denial. He said conservatives should face the facts. Climate change is real. They should hold coal-fired power plants accountable for the diseases that their pollution produces, and we should even consider a carbon tax. What happened to him? In 2010, he was challenged in a primary by a Tea Party Republican, and he lost. So he's out of the Congress now. So what someone like Kahan would say, if you are one person, this is a calculation you can almost make. Even a member of Congress, one member of Congress, can't do very much personally to move the ball on climate. All he can do is get himself booted out of office, which is what happened to this man. So, now, meanwhile, and here's where the problem of objectivity comes in. It's too sad to, you all know where this is, I'm sure. But anyway, so all of these bad things are reinforced by the problem of objectivity, which is the wish, or even the obligation, the ethical obligation of mainstream journalism to give everybody a chance to tell their side of the story, to give all sides of the story, even when the story really only has one side. So there are reasons why we do this. One of them is, in the early days of the mass media, when something that we think of as the mass media was first coming into existence. The business model of the mass media was to have a publication of some kind, and it could even be like on TV when television came in and so on. And you made your money by attracting an audience to that publication and selling the audience to advertisers. So you wanted to have as broad a readership base, as broad an audience as possible. And the way you did that was by not taking sides, by trying to be fair, by trying to give all sides of the story. And that became kind of ingrained for us in mainstream journalism. In science, it's aggravated by the fact that no science journalist can know enough about anything she's called upon to write about. The field is way too vast, and we have the same ignorance as anybody else. So you don't want to stand up and take responsibility for views yourself that you don't have enough knowledge of. So you end up quoting people, and you end up giving all sides of the story and giving everyone their say. We do that in part because there have been many cases in which the overwhelming scientific evidence turned out to be wrong. For example, you do not get an ulcer because you lead a stressful life and eat too much spicy food. You get an ulcer because of something called Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium in your stomach. And this idea, when it was first put forward, was laughed at all over the world until it turned out to be true. 2 Australian doctors thought it up, and they ended up in Stockholm getting a nice medal from the King of Sweden. So majority rules is not the case in science. So the mere fact that the weight of the evidence is on one side is not necessarily enough for us. Also, plenty of people who write about climate remember what happened when James Hansen got up in the Senate. He testified in the Senate in 1988. He was the first person to say, we have heard the signal. We can differentiate the signal from the noise that says we are feeling the effects of human-induced climate change. And the rest of the scientific community thought he was out ahead of the data, and they came down on him like a ton of bricks. So we don't feel like it's up to us to get out ahead of the data. It would be, we feel like it would be bad. So what we did was, we would write about this issue, and we would say, the vast majority of scientific wisdom says that human activity is altering the chemistry of the environment, blah, blah, blah. And there is a small group of outliers, or skeptics, or deniers. The problem with that is, and that we held on to that formula for a long time with climate, too long, I think. But the problem with that is, if you put a skeptic or a denier, or however you want to call them, into your article, the assumption, the readers I think, can be forgiven for assuming that the reason why you put it in there is because you think that person has something that's worthwhile to listen to or to read. And that's where the problem comes in. So just you might, as a matter of interest, the AP in September, they changed their style book, the AP being the Associated Press, the major news service in the United States. They don't use the phrase climate skeptics or climate deniers. They don't want to see the people described as deniers. They want them described as doubters. Doubters, people who doubt. They don't like skeptic because I think for the good reason that the default position of science is skepticism. And all working scientists are, in a way, skeptics. But they don't like deniers because, as Professor McIntyre said, it has this aura of somehow sleaziness about it, or people attach it in their minds to Holocaust denial. So now the AP has to call them doubters. Does this, advance us? I don't know. But the problem of objectivity, in my opinion, is the most difficult problem in science journalism. I think it's absolutely intractable. I don't have a clue how to solve it. But it gets us into trouble. The only thing I can say about it is, consider the alternative, and the alternative is a world in which places like MSNBC and Fox News don't feel the need to give all sides of the story. The audience fragments, which is what is happening in our media environment. The audience is fragmenting, and you get more and more people who divide up and find themselves in an echo chamber hearing only ideas that they already agree with. That is, I think, the alternative to the give all sides of the story approach of the mainstream media. I hope that it can be fixed, but I have no idea how. Anyway, so what's the answer? Where does this leave us? I was at a conference in Newport about a week or so ago, organized by the Newport Restoration Foundation, and there I heard a presentation by a woman named Lauren Carson, who is a state representative from Newport. And she has organized a study committee. She's interested in climate change, but she didn't name it a climate change committee. It's a committee on flood damage. And this is, you can see why somebody would be interested in flood damage if she lives in Newport. And flood damage, you can try to address flood damage regardless of what your views on climate change are, but inevitably you will be, if you confront this issue, you will be brought around to the climate question. And it's harder anyway, to deny when this kind of stuff is in your feet. This is the house, one of the recent acquisitions of the Newport Restoration Foundation. It's the Christopher Townsend House on Bridge Street in Newport, and it has a terrible, terrible flooding problem. So it's my opinion that one thing that can be done to open a door is to bring people in locally and encourage them to act on aspects of things and hope that that opens their eyes to other problems. Other than that, I have no answers. So thank you very much. And